So we looked at book 1 last class session, and in book 1, on the nature of the gods, we get the characters being set up, and you get introduced to them, and you figure out, okay, this guy's an Epicurean, this guy's an academic, this guy's a Stoic, and you have some general idea about what that means, and then the Epicurean does his song and dance, and attacks everybody else and their viewpoints, and then presents his own, and then Kata, the academic, he criticizes the Epicurean's point of view. And one of the things I'd like to tell you about Cicero is Cicero considered the Epicureans in certain respects kind of philosophical lightweights. They were one of the really important schools of philosophy at his time, and they have been very influential throughout all of history. There's sort of an Epicurean revival in the Renaissance and in the modern period. A lot of people resonate quite well with Epicurus and his followers because they say, you know, atomic theory and elements, that makes a lot of sense. They're materialists. In ethics, a lot of people are hedonists, meaning that they think pleasure is the primary good, and so they kind of like Epicurus for that. Cicero, though, thought that the Epicureans were more bluster than real substance. And so what we've been doing up to this point is kind of warm-up, you might say. Cicero thought there was a lot more to the Stoic position, and you notice by the end of the dialogue, even though Cicero belongs to the academic school, he says that he thinks that the Stoic guy in the dialogue, Balbus, was somewhat more convincing than the other guy who just actually got the last word, who got to criticize the Stoic. So, you know, why would that be? Well, the Stoics had a very comprehensive kind of system and doctrine about all different matters. Some of them, you know, being religious matters. And just to give you a little bit of background, and we can come back to this a little bit later on. You know, in the ancient world, we often, like I said, have this notion that the Greeks had their, you know, gods, and there were these Olympian gods like Zeus and Hera, and Aphrodite and Ares and Athena, and they all just like had their sort of things that they did, and you know, we know some of the stories about them, like Zeus liked to sleep around a lot, and you know, get human women pregnant, and then some of them would become gods, and some would become heroes, like Hercules, for example. And Hera didn't like this, so Hera would, you know, try to kill little Hercules, and you know, she was kind of a jealous wife, understandably so, because Zeus is a kind of a bad guy in that respect. He actually, with one of his kids, like hides him inside of his calf, cuts his calf muscle open and makes it into a womb after Hera kills that guy's mom. I think that was Dionysus. You know, and we have stories like Aphrodite is married to Hephaestus, the smith, but he's kind of an ugly guy and not very romantic, so she actually sleeps with the god of war, Ares, Hephaestus' brother, and he makes a net that will fall on them and catches them in the act, and you know, everybody's laughing at them. A lot of stories like this. Now, did the Greeks actually believe this sort of thing? Well, some of them did. How believable would you find these stories if you were a philosopher, if you were somebody who developed a fairly high level of culture? Is that the way you would picture the divine? The divine consists in all these kind of almost sitcom-like creatures, you know, who are kind of cruel, actually. They mess around with mortals and sometimes do terrible things to them. You know, it's not actually a good thing necessarily to be loved by a god, because sometimes that can get you in trouble as well, especially if you're one of Zeus's, you know, paramours. Is this the way you would think of it? Probably not, right? A lot of ancient Greeks did too. They said there's got to be some better explanation of this. They didn't say it's all BS, gods, this whole notion, let's get rid of all of it and become atheists. There were some atheists in the ancient period, and there were some agnostics, and you've always got some people who are being hypocrites too, right? But the philosophers wanted to come up with a better conception of the gods, or of God. You know, some of them ended up in something like monotheism. Stoicism is kind of a weird hybrid mix, as we'll see. It's kind of hard to tell whether they believe in gods or God, where the gods are sort of aspects or parts of the God. This was very attractive to people who were intellectually developed. What the Stoics had to offer was a fairly comprehensive doctrine about religious matters. And this was a time when people were searching. They were really hungry for having some sort of explanation about something bigger than us, something greater than just human beings. Now, Balbus talks about the Stoics as organizing this into 4 main issues. And he's crediting this to a Stoic guy named Chrysippus. Chrysippus was the third, sort of top guy in the Stoic school after Cleanthes and Zeno, who starts the school. Chrysippus was really the guy who did the most organization. Zeno, he did, some work. Cleanthes was not particularly bright, but was very, very persevering and sort of embodied the Stoic lifestyle. And then Cleanthes was a brainiac and wrote book after book after book after book, articulating the Stoic position, defending it against everybody else, arguing with all these different people. He was one of the most prolific writers of antiquity. So Cleanthes, when you're writing that much, you have to organize what you're writing, right? You guys know this from writing papers. It's one thing to write a whole bunch of stuff in one stream of consciousness, thing. Somebody else looks at it and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. There's a lot of interesting stuff here, but where's the structure? So this is the structure that he gave it. He said, well, one thing you got to talk about is the existence of gods. And, why is this such an important issue? Why do you think? If you're going to talk about religion, why should you start with the existence of the gods or God? Yeah.
Because without the gods, there is no religion at all, so you have to decide whether it even exists.
Really, you shouldn't spend a lot of time, if you're doing philosophy, you shouldn't spend a lot of time talking about things that don't exist. Because then you're just wasting everybody's time. If there are atoms, great, then we can talk about atoms. But if there's no such thing as an atom, there's other ways of explaining matter, then probably you should, focus on that instead. So if there aren't any gods to start with, you really don't get off the ground in philosophy of religion. Then we want to know about what they call the nature of the gods. Okay, what are the gods like? What's your conception of God? Is God sort of like a big, shiny, well-muscled guy who throws lightning? There's Zeus, right? Or maybe surrounded by clouds. He's got a long white beard. Is God the totem of your clan in some indigenous religion? That's a very different conception of God. That's a different nature of God, right? Then they wanted to talk about a couple other things that might seem to fit into the nature of the gods, but they thought these were special, important topics. So, are the gods involved in management, you could say? We've got this whole universe around us, physical things, and we're a little bit detached from that because we live in a highly technological age. If we were Plato, we'd be having this in a fairly open area, right? Actually a gymnasium where people would practice exercise of different sorts and then, do some philosophy. We do it inside of a classroom. The outside is being kept out there, so we're not affected by the weather. But it wasn't that way for the ancient Greeks. They were much more connected to the natural world. And they want to know, do the gods actually do stuff in the natural world? Remember, these guys, they don't have the kind of science that we do. You guys know lightning is what? What happens to produce lightning? There's energy.
Positively charged.
Yeah, we've got this whole conception of positive and negative charges, and I forget whether the clouds are positively charged and the Earth is negatively charged, or whether it's the other way around. Some of you science people probably know better. I haven't looked at this for a long time, but I know that's our conception, right? The Greeks, they wanted to figure out, well, what's going on when there's lightning. Is that God mad at me? Or is that totally natural phenomenon disconnected from whatever it is that we're thinking about with religion? The Epicureans said, hey, the gods don't mess around with the universe. That's why they're happy, because they don't have jobs. The Stoics said, no, all this physical stuff that's going on, the gods are actually driving that. They're making that happen. And then finally, there is a part of the universe that we're really concerned with. Do the gods care about human beings and human affairs? Are the gods interested in what we do? Or could they, care less? Again, the Epicureans, hey, that's why the gods are happy, because they don't think about all of us schmucks down here and the stupid things that we do and all these dumb prayers that we're making to them that are usually contradictory. Two guys going to fight over the same girl, praying for that girl. I mean, think about the problems that the gods would have in trying to answer prayers. All these contradictory desires being expressed. Maybe there is something to the Epicurean thought that the gods would be a lot happier if they just say, it's up to you. Well, again, the Stoics thought that the gods actually do care about human beings. That you can see this reflected not only in the answers to prayers or divination or things like that, but in the very way in which we're made. That the gods gave us something that they didn't give to the other animals. That is, makes us different. It's a great gift. And we'll get to that in a while. So he organizes things into this sort of structure. And so we're going to start with the question of existence first. And as far as I can tell, there's not a lot of discussion about this or a lot of literature on this. There are 5 main arguments for the existence of God that are being made in this book, specifically in this section of Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods. And you might say, well, why do you need arguments for the existence of God? Well, if somebody doesn't believe that God exists, then you could convince them with that. When else might you want an argument for whether God exists or not? You can convince somebody else who doesn't believe. This is what people call apologetics in Christian circles. When else does a person want an argument, though? Yeah.
Like maybe how you view God?
Well, that's interesting because each one of these arguments not only will hopefully demonstrate that God has to exist, but it will also be a way of trying to wrap your head around the way God is. So God's existence and God's nature are connected. But let's go a little bit further. Let's say you were in kind of a doubting mood. Why would you want an argument? Yeah.
Reaffirmation of what you think is correct.
Very good. Yeah. Sometimes we make arguments to ourselves because we were sure about something, and now we're not quite so sure, and we want to see if we can strengthen our previous belief. So let's take something a lot less weighty than the existence of the gods. You're married to somebody, and they're coming home real late at night frequently, and we'll make it a guy so I can think of what was similar things I think with a girl. So guy comes home late at night, no explanation, real cagey about his phone, got some lipstick on his collar, kind of smells like perfume, his hair's all messed up, clothes are kind of screwed up, and this happens a couple times. Now his wife, should say, I wonder what's going on, and she's got a belief previously this guy's faithful, right? Should that be thrown into question at that point? Probably, right? If she doesn't, then we'd probably say she's a little bit gullible. Now, let's say she wants to continue to believe that her husband is still faithful. Now, she might come up with some sort of argument for, how these things can be explained. That's probably an argument you don't want to give yourself, because probably he is. You know, with these sort of signs, he probably is doing it. But people make arguments to themselves all the time. We don't often think of them in terms of arguments. We think of them as like just this process of reaffirmation. There's another case too, where you genuinely don't know. And you say, I want proof. I would like to believe that there's God, that God exists, that this isn't just a bunch of fables, but I don't know. So can you provide me with some sort of evidence? And like we said, when it comes down to the existence of God, you can't like just, look around. Okay, where's Zeus? Is he here? That's not going to work. It's not that kind of evidence that you're looking for. It's something that your mind can find acceptable, something that you can wrap your head around. We call that a rational proof. So he gives you 5 different arguments about this. One is what we call the argument from common consent. And we looked at this one last time with the Epicureans, because they made that argument, right? Another is what we call the argument from miracles. The third one is what we call the argument from design, or sometimes it's called the teleological argument. Fourth one is the argument from intelligence. And the fifth one is the argument from degrees of being. And very often when we're teaching this stuff to undergraduates, we don't begin with somebody like Cicero. As a matter of fact, Cicero is fairly rarely taught. The main reason why you guys are reading Cicero is because I happened to read Cicero and saw all this stuff in there, and I was like, wow, this would be a great thing to have people encounter. Usually we'll have you read something like, St. Anselm and Thomas Aquinas and Descartes. Yeah.
Can you use move to the side?
Sure.
Sorry.
And then, have you come to people who criticize these arguments like Immanuel Kant. And some of these arguments don't often get treated by philosophers. The ones that you would encounter in a typical philosophy textbook would include the argument from design, but then they would include things like what we call the ontological argument and the cosmological argument, and maybe a few other ones, and that would be about it. They wouldn't include some of these, because some of these aren't very well understood by philosophers, and some of them aren't very highly regarded by philosophers, in particular the argument from miracles. At least in Cicero's time, people thought these were fairly decent arguments. At least the Stoics did. We're going to see some of these arguments have some real flaws in them, but we want to look at them each in turn. And we're not going to look at the flaws so much today. We'll look at them much more extensively next time. I'll just point out a few things. Let's start with the argument from common consent. How does this work? Do you guys remember from last class? Yeah.
It's kind of like a similar basis everybody can agree on.
Okay, so there is something that's agreed on. What's actually agreed on? Yeah.
That there is, like, the gods exist.
Yeah, so each culture, you look at them, nobody's making them come up with these ideas. They're all coming up with some sort of idea of God. Okay, the gods look different. We saw the Epicureans kind of stepped in it when they were saying, oh, everybody thinks the gods have human form. Because we know that's not the case. The Egyptians got these weird hybrids with, like a human body and then, a cat or an eagle's head or you name it, crocodiles. The Egyptians actually had a bull that they worshipped as divine. You go around the world, you're going to find a lot of things that people are willing to say is God and willing to say is divine. But they all do have something, right? So that many people can't be wrong. There's got to be something out there that these are all tending towards. That's the argument from common consent. And, we looked at, is this a really strong argument or not? It's not the strongest argument. What's the one weak point with it? Well, there's quite a few things that we might all believe in, but it doesn't actually make it true. And we looked at, you guys actually suggested some really interesting things, like, well, maybe all these ideas came from one place, which Cicero didn't consider, but that's a plausible explanation for that phenomenon of universal belief in something or another. In our own time, this would not be a particularly good argument because there are atheist countries, so not all cultures actually do believe in the gods. The Stoics, one of the arguments that Balbus makes to reinforce this is really interesting. He actually says, you know, if you look at history, what we see up until our time, and remember, he's not writing in our time, you know, after Nietzsche has said God is dead and all that sort of stuff. He's writing back in the ancient period. And he's saying, you know, people are believing this more and more and more. Look, even the philosophers are believing in this sort of stuff. So, you know, an idea that catches on and seems to have some staying power, that's different from an idea that we just kind of made up in our head. He uses the example of centaurs. What are centaurs?
Is it the half-horse type thing?
Yeah, and they, you know, they have bows, and you know, they don't have to wear any clothes, of course, because the man part is, you know, shirtless, and then the horse part's got hair. So, you know, they get to go around, and some of them play music, and then some of them, you know, shoot their bows at things, and by this time, everybody who's cultured thinks that's all BS. There's no such thing as a centaur. It's a nice story, but nobody really believes in this except for maybe some country people who are, you know, unenlightened. Why did the idea die out? Well, because it was just an imagination. Are there other imaginary things you can think about for us where they've kind of died out over time? Think back to, you know, our treatment of race. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to, you were going on to
No,
something
no,
else,
what's
but I was
yours? And
gonna
I'll say what mine is.
things that people have believed,
Yeah, that are just imaginary.
like mermaids and...
Okay. Yeah, I mean, a mermaid is kind of the same thing. You take like the top of a human and plop it on a fish, and there you go. You know? Yeah.
Like when we were kids, we believed in Santa Claus and ghouls and
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy. You know, we make movies with these, you know, where they all get together and, like, you know, save the world or things like that. But they're imaginary. The thing I was going to say is, you know, if you think about the notion of race, just the way it was about 100 years ago, where there was this belief that you had these distinct races of human being, and each one had its own attributes, and, you know, if they mix together, it weakens the strain and produces defective hybrids. A lot of people, you know, sort of regulated their lives on that basis, and they had very strong emotional reactions. And, you know, there are still some people, I think, today who have that sort of view of race. Most people, you know something about genetics, and they know that you can take any human being and any other human being, no matter what skin color, eye shape, facial features, build, because, you know, actually some races are tall and some races are short, you know, if you actually want to get very technical about it. And you can mix them together, and they can make babies that are human. We're all one race, you know. The idea dies out over time, and hopefully it'll die out altogether and just be a historical phenomenon, because it's pretty deleterious to us. The idea dies out because it's imaginary. A lot of people believed in things like fairies. Any of you believe in fairies? Or leprechauns? The little people who, you know, do things? Okay, well, there you go. And the reason, you know, why a lot of us believed in that sort of thing is probably because, you know, we were gullible and we watched too many TV shows in our generations. Because, you know, they have all these things. And when we were really little, we might actually think things on TV are real. You might think that cartoons, you know, different cartoon characters are real. But it's just imagination. And as you get older, you get rid of that. Well, this idea about God, that there is something like a divine, something greater than us, that hasn't gone away. You know, this is an interesting one to think about even for modernity. Sure, there's atheist countries. I'm sure there's a lot of people who are not religious. But, you know, one of the things that was predicted about modernity is as we get more and more modern, religion should vanish. Has it? Has it vanished in even the you know, supposedly first world modern countries? It has in some of them. Church attendance in, you know, like Italy, France, Spain is like, you know, in the single digits. But not everybody. And here in America, America's pretty religious. And there are other places where religion exercises a great effect. So the Stoics would look at that sort of thing and they'd say, see, that's an example of an idea with staying power. Why does that idea have staying power? Because it's not just imagination. It reflects something about our nature. It reflects something that's kind of hardwired into us. And that's why we have this common idea. So therefore, there must be something corresponding to that. And I'm going to leave it an open question whether that's a good argument or not. We'll talk about that next time, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say there's one thing that could go
Okay.
very strongly against that. In the past, there was a strong idea and belief in dragons. Like they showed up in almost every culture all over the place.
Oh, that's a good example, yeah.
Of a flying, fire-breathing lizard.
Yeah.
And yet, it showed up in European,
Chinese, yeah.
even in some Middle Eastern and Indian
Okay.
cultures. They all show up at one given time period.
Yeah.
And then, poof, they're all gone. There's almost no physical remains of such things even ever existing, but...
Yeah. Well, that'd be an interesting case in point where you could say, well, just because there's a common idea, maybe that there is just sort of a common imagination that's not actually veridical. Let's go on and look at the next one. Now, this one, philosophers in general don't take seriously at all. And I'm not even sure that Cicero means it to be taken seriously because he has his academic character, like, savagely attack this. But the basic idea is this. How do you know that God exists? Well, because God does things miraculous, and basically two different kinds of things. One is like sometimes God shows up and appears, or the gods, and he's got all these examples of, well, they saw this God fighting on horseback, and this thing helping out the Romans or the Greeks or whoever. The other would be through God revealing his or her or its will through what we call divination, fortune telling. Fortune telling not just in the sense of like, some sort of vague fortune out there, but some sort of activity that's supposed to reveal the will of the gods. So if you're an ancient Greek or Roman, you would maybe go to an oracle and ask a question, or you would have a priest cut open a bird look at the flights of birds, or cut open a sacrificial victim and look at his liver, and look at the different spots, and there was like a system for that, augury, which actually some of the priests even thought was laughable. You might cast lots, in the Bible, the Urim and Thummim, that the priests would actually throw to divine the will of the Hebrew God. Those were dice, basically, and they would throw them. In the Chinese, they have the Book of Changes, the I Ching, and that's casting coins or euro stocks, and somehow you connect this up with God revealing himself or herself or whatever, or God's will for human beings. Now, the idea is this. You couldn't have that kind of experience if there wasn't a God. People have that kind of experience, therefore there's a God. Well, that sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Do you see any problems with this? And any objections that somebody might raise? Yeah.
Well, anybody can say, hey, I had this divine sight and now I believe in God type of thing, but they could just be making that up for reasons or just to get their 15 minutes.
Okay, so people want attention and maybe they do that, yeah.
Everything you can't explain seems miraculous, but once you have
An explanation
behind it, it's really not.
Yeah, that's another problem too. There's all sorts of issues that come up with this. The sailors. At one point, Cicero says the sailors who died at sea when they were praying, they didn't leave any counter offerings in the temple saying, "Hey, the God didn't do a thing for me." What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, as far as today is concerned in medicine and the way people are cured and healed or whatever it is, that's what I think of when I think of the miracles concept, because not as much then, but more so now, because we have so many advances in technology and research and science. There are still things that happen all the time that are documented in research and online and in all different types of databases that medical recoveries are unexplainable. And
Yeah, anomalous things.
yeah, exactly. And things could always happen by chance with the human body, but for them to happen in all those different types of instances where somebody could just be cured in all these different types of
Yeah.
ways, all different types of people cured in all different types of ways.
So you're making an argument to strengthen this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
I was just going to say that the mind sees what it wants to see in some regards, so...
There's a problem too. Interpretation. In order to see a miracle as a miracle, because two people could be looking at the same thing and one says, yeah, a miracle took place, and the other one says, I don't see it. Somehow you have to be kind of engaged in this. And Cicero doesn't really worry that much about that, in part because he's got other reasons for attacking this particular argument. But he seems to think this is kind of a lightweight argument. A lot of people, in religious circles seem to view this as a good argument, but it might be more along the lines of what you're talking about, where it reveals the nature of God rather than actually proving that God exists necessarily. Now, when we get to design, here we get into something that has some metaphysical depth. And here's the basic idea of the design argument. So there's a lot of design arguments out there. People are still making these today. When you hear about people talking about intelligent design, as opposed to creationism, but also as opposed to evolution, that's the concept of design that we're thinking of here. That there would be some sort of intelligent designer who arranged all the things in the universe and made them be the way that they are. And if you, again, if you are a scientist and you start looking at just, the eye and the evolution of the eye, Darwin always said, this is one of my real trouble points. I always want to stay away from that in conversation, because a lot of things I can explain pretty easily by natural selection. The eyeball, that's a toughie. You know why? Because so many things have to happen in order for this wonderful, just amazing bit of wetware technology in our heads to have the capacities that it does. Just think about what your eye can do, and then compare it to the eyeballs that much lower animals have. We don't just sense light and put together images. You have this whole range of color, right? You can discriminate all these different beautiful colors. What's doing the job for that? These weird little rods and cones in the back of it. There's all this optical stuff that's taking place. I mean, we know about this because we can produce, things to actually help out. If I take this off, you're just a bunch of blurs. Colorful blurs, but just blurs. Put this on, and now things are the way they're supposed to be with these eyeballs, and now you're all back to being, sharp, identifiable human beings again that I can tell apart from each other, other than the colors of your clothes and hair and faces and things like that. So, think about all sorts of other things too. Think about how adapted the Earth is to life. Think about how many things had to come together in the right way in order to just get life started, and then to continue it and sustain it. Doesn't it seem as if this reflects some sort of complexity and maybe something like an intentional design? Things are designed to do these sorts of things. They have functions. Maybe they're not all designed the best way. There are mistakes made every once in a while. And maybe some of the things are designed in such ways that they screw up other things. Like think about viruses. And have you ever look into what a virus really is? It's an amazing thing. It's a terrible thing. Wish we didn't have them. But they're also amazing. A virus really is a bit of protein surrounding some genetic code. And that genetic code gets used by the virus to make the virus later on. It'll latch onto a cell, and the protein shell is just, basically to protect it. And it gets to the shell, and then it injects that code, and that code goes in and seeks out the cell's own code, inserts itself, and changes that code. And you know what it changes it to make it do?
More viruses.
Make more viruses, right. This is why a computer virus is analogous to a biological virus. And it takes the cell over and turns it into a big virus production factory, cell stops doing all the other stuff, and then the cell explodes, and all these little viruses go off. That's pretty cool. That's, you know, there's a lot of things going on there that, you know, you can investigate, and there's all this, you know, complexity, and it looks like almost intentional design to it. Now, think about things that we have in the human world. I'm not going to use the iPhone because I've used that too many times. It's an example already. Think about these, right? What is this?
Hearing.
Key ring, and so obviously it's got keys on it, and you've got 2 car keys and one of the card clickers, and then what are these things?
Discount cards.
Discount cards, yeah, or like my library cards on here too. And you know, you can scan these. I have a lot of this crap. Now that I look at it, I shop at a lot of places apparently. You just keep accumulating these as you get older. Why are these keys the way they are? Car keys used to look different than this, yeah.
Would that be like, at that point in time, like the human perception of perfection for that like object?
Maybe. I don't know if the Ford company like said we want the perfect car key, because Ford doesn't do anything perfectly. I can tell you that. I'm a Ford user, you know. But yeah, they designed it, and I think it's supposed to be kind of, you know, fit in your hand nicely. I like these keys better. I'm a person who doesn't like change, and so when these keys first came out, I was like, this is crap. I can't stand these, you know. Now I actually I see why. They're a lot easier to hold when it's cold or wet or stuff like that. It's kind of nice to have them. It's also nice to have this clicker thing. I hated this when it first came out, you know, but now I understand its purpose. Yeah.
I was going to say it's whatever is aesthetically pleasing to the population at the time. So I'm pretty sure they go out and get like 1,000 people.
Do surveys.
Or hand them out and say, hey, which one do you prefer?
Yeah. Now notice what's going on here. There's intentional design. They set this up in this way for a reason. Even the key ring itself. Why are all these keys on here? So I have them all in one place when I need them. I even have my library card on here. You know, when I need it, I can just shove it in my pocket, and now I'm good to go. So there's an intentional design. The argument from design works by saying, look, there's a similarity between what human beings do and the way we assemble things and the way the world as a whole and the things in it are, the natural things. This didn't happen by chance. Somebody designed things this way. Similarly, there must be some, you know, godlike, divine designer who created all these other natural phenomena. That's the argument from design. So when people are talking about intelligent design, they're talking about that kind of designer, who would be God or the gods. Everybody clear about that? That's got some, you know, philosophers, a lot of them don't accept that. A lot of philosophers do accept that. That's one that's had some real staying power. Yeah.
So with the idea of design, it's following the idea of since things fit together so perfectly, it must be by design instead of by, say, just
Chance or
just the
random
properties of what it
adaptation,
is.
or yeah.
Right.
It's there's a problem with this, but I want to put that problem off until next class session. Let's move to the argument from intelligence now. So this is an argument that doesn't get made an awful lot in philosophy textbooks and doesn't seem to be particularly well understood by a lot of present-day philosophers of religion, but was quite popular back in the ancient period, both among the pagans and then later among, you know, Jews, Christians, Muslims. And here's how it works. What's really distinctive about us is having reason or intelligence, however you want to conceive of it. There's kind of a quantum leap from the other animals to us. We have a lot of other things in common with them: desire, being aware of our surroundings, needing to eat, reproduce, all that sort of stuff. But we have rationality. And it's easy to explain where all the other things about us came from. Where did all this meat and bones that I'm carrying around come from? You know, from the physical elements that were put together in certain ways. That's easy enough to explain. The Greeks often, and you see this in this argument, tended to think of the psyche or the soul as being, kind of like a breath or a spirit. And the Stoics were materialists, so they actually did see it that way. Where did that come from? Maybe from the winds, because that's that kind of thing. Where did intelligence come from? Could it have come from lower things that were not themselves intelligent? Well, do you get higher things coming from higher things in an ontological sense, better, greater, having more active capacities? Do you get those coming from a lower thing? Or do they need to come from something like themselves? Well, we didn't make ourselves intelligent. So our intelligence itself must have come from something else that's intelligent. So it's not going to be coming from something below us, plants, animals, rocks, iPhones, things like that. That's a product, right? It's got to have come from something else, something divine. Since it's not human, it's going to have to be divine. We came from at least that part of ourselves that's intelligent, came from a divine intelligence. Now the Stoics, we're going to talk about this in a moment, they didn't understand God as like being outside of the world the way Jews, Christian, Muslims, monotheists do. A transcendent God, they understood as God as being the world. So that meant that the world itself had to be intelligent in some sense. And this leads to some kind of weird paradoxes that we'll talk about next time, because the academics are going to say, that doesn't make any sense. But the idea was that the only way in which we can explain the existence of our own intelligence, which is something that we understand by using what? By using our intelligence. The only way in which we can actually even understand the origin of our own intelligence is by seeing it in some cause that is itself intelligent, which would have to be God. This is an interesting argument. This is something worth wrapping your head around, whether you accept it or don't accept it. Because one of the things that we do want to be able to explain is, where did we get this big brain from? And not just the brain, but all the activities that go with it. And we'll look at that again next class as well. The degrees of being argument is based on a notion that you might not buy. It's also based on this notion that was fairly widespread in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, that there are degrees of being. So you start out with just like bare being, like what this paper has. It's not alive, it's not sentient, it's definitely not rational. It exists, right? But its kind of existence is a lower kind of existence than, say, something that's alive. So of the virus that's in every one of your systems, because every one of you is carrying some sort of virus, whether you're sick or not. We're all carrying bacteria and viruses. Those are, in a certain sense, greater beings in this paper. Even though they're littler physically, they're greater in that they have a higher degree of being.
They have a function.
They have a function. They can take in other things. They live. They experience. As we get higher and higher and higher up, we get away from the merely, viruses don't really think a lot. They don't really do much of anything other than make new viruses. That and die. And they don't even really die in a real sense even. They're that close to the mineral world. We get to the animal world. Now you think about your dog or your cat. It loves you. Sometimes it hates you. You stand in the way of what it wants. Which might even be like you giving it attention because you're looking at a book or something like that. It looks around. It hunts. It plays. That's a higher degree of being than a virus. Now, you are at a yet higher degree of being because you're a rational being. You're not a mere animal. You are an animal. We never want to forget that fact. We are animals. We do have all these desires, drives, corporeality. But there's something to you that's at a higher degree of being, has greater ontological dignity or density, or however you want to conceive of it metaphysically. Are you the highest? That's the question. Are you the top of the metaphysical food chain, you might say? Or is there anything higher than you? The argument from the degrees of being works by saying, look, if you're going to have this whole notion of degrees of being, there has to be some top level, and it's got to be something that is absolutely perfect. Yeah, something that is, just the best exemplar of everything in this ladder. Now ask yourself this about your rationality. Are you perfectly rational? Have you ever done anything irrational? Do you have to learn sometimes from your mistakes? So you're not the top, are you? You could think you are, but if you do, then you're a narcissist. You're nuts, because you're not the top. There's got to be something higher, something better than you, and that has to exist not just in our imagination. That has to actually exist in order for this whole chain of being, this whole blessing, this whole metaphysical set of postulates to work. Again, this is also a very interesting proof. Some people say, yeah, this makes sense. Other people say, I can't even understand what this is about, depending on what your philosophical commitments are. And the Stoics definitely bought into this. A lot of people in ancient and medieval times bought into it. I myself, actually, I'll level with you. In fact, I'm a Platonist of sorts, and I believe there are degrees of being. That's an unpopular view among present-day philosophers. So I'm more tempted to believe in this argument than other people might be. A lot of modern-day philosophers would say this notion of degrees of being doesn't really make any sense. Their ontology is kind of a flat ontology. But if you have this notion of degrees of being, then you can get an argument for God's existence out of it. Again, not a God that's outside of the world for the Stoics, but a God who's somehow the world itself or immanent to it. So now is actually a good time to move away from these proofs and tell you a little bit about their notion of God. Because I think this, as you're reading through this text, this is probably something that would confuse you. So, this is the world, or the universe. All right? Familiar concept to you from cosmology, from your earth science classes and things like that. And here's human beings, just a tiny little part of the world, and we exist on the earth, which has all these natural processes going on. We should put human much smaller because we're just a tiny part of it. And the way that they understood the universe was there were these other things, stars, out there. And Stoics were always a little kind of fuzzy about this. But, you'd have to be fuzzy back then, all right? Because we didn't have the astronomical capabilities that we did. And this isn't a bad, implausible idea. At least you got a round world that's in the middle, rather than a flat earth. And the Stoics, here's the way, you could think of things for like a Christian or Muslim or Jewish perspective. God is somehow outside of this whole thing and creates everything, gets the whole ball rolling, makes everything the way it is. And, it gets a little tricky because is God, like in some weird place outside of the universe? No, because God, in traditional theology is immanent. He's present at every point in the universe at every time, but he's also transcendent to it. For the Stoics, that's not the case. So the thing that we would think of as analogous to God, with a capital G, is actually the whole world or the universe. And the whole world or the universe possesses these divine attributes that we typically, in our culture, attribute to this, transcendent notion of God. So being all-powerful, rational, sentient, being good, You know, being the whole ball of wax, being the top thing. And, you know, we human beings, are we good? Some of the time, right? All of you have some goodness in you. Probably quite a bit, you know, probably some of you quite a bit more than I do. Are you good all the time? No. And are you going to reach some point in your life where you, by your, you know, dint of your hard effort and constant discipline, are good all the time and never, ever, ever do anything wrong? Probably not. If you do, that's great. Even the saints, you know, have bad days and tell people off sometimes. And, you know, they're not always saintly in every single respect, right? God would be, though. God would be totally good. God would not have any sort of restrictions on God's goodness the way that we do. Same thing with rationality. God would be totally rational. When I was a math major, I used to think of God as sort of the being that could answer all of the problems that in mathematics we can't solve. Because there are unsolvable problems in mathematics. And God would have the answer to those. And then if I was good and got to heaven, I've always got, you know, sort of screwball ideas about why I want to get to heaven. They're never the sort of catechism thing of, because I want to be with God so I can love God and you know, worship God through all eternity. It's I'm more like Socrates. I want to get the answers to the questions that I don't have. And if I go to the good place, then I'm likely to get those answers. If I go to the bad place, maybe it's the bad place in part because I'll never get those answers I want. You know, I want to go to heaven in part because St. Anselm is there, and I want to pester him and find out, you know, make him talk to me about, you know, some of the stuff that he wrote about that I'm still puzzled about. You know, either that or I want to see the people that, you know, I'm fairly confident are up there that I miss or things like that. Those aren't particularly good reasons from, you know, traditional Christian doctrine perspective. But yeah, it would make sense for a Stoic. There isn't any heaven for a Stoic, though. There's just the universe that you're a part of, right? God would be all-powerful, too, because what's more powerful than the universe? Nothing. I mean, the universe does what it's going to do inside of itself. So think of God as like the entire universe, rational. There's like an intelligence and intentionality pervading everything that makes things go the way that they are, that arranges things for the best. It doesn't necessarily look that way to us, but that's the way that it works. That's what we call providence, providential ordering. Then you might say, well, then what are all these other gods? How does that business fit in? And that's where it gets really messy. Because there's all these, let's call them God with a small g, right? And from the Stoic perspective, well, you got to have these little godlets organizing the universe and doing, you can think of them as sort of like having delegated powers, you know? And this is, you know, this is where it gets very, very tricky. How do they fit in together? That's not explained. But the idea is there is God, and then there's gods. We might think of these, if you're, you know, inclined towards traditional Christian or Muslim or Jewish theology, we might think of these as being something like angels, because that's the job that angels did in some of these older medieval theologies. But the Stoics had these gods who all participated in the working of the universe. So what about like Zeus and things like that? Well, those are just allegories. What's an allegory? Do you guys know this term? It's a story. Is it meant to be true? Yeah.
Aren't they just supposed to be like representative figures or something?
Yes. So an allegory is a story that really tells another deeper story, and the original story is not supposed to be true. Like the boy who cried wolf. Was there really a little boy who cried wolf a whole bunch of times, and then the neighbors finally got tired of his BS, and when the real wolf came, they said, screw him, let the wolf eat him. He's probably, you know, joking around with us again. No. But is that supposed to teach you something? What's it supposed to teach you? Is it only about crying wolf? How many times have you guys run into that situation where, oh, there's a wolf. I better cry wolf. What is it teaching you about? Something broader, right? What is it teaching you about? Yeah.
Not to make up stories and to be honest.
Yeah, and especially stories about what you need or want or things like that or danger. Because then when you really do need something, everybody's going to be tired of you by that point, and they're not going to listen to you. So that's the deeper meaning. That's the real meaning. So the Stoics thought when it came to all the myths and legends and stuff like that, that was what was going on, allegories. The real stuff is this. All of these things are working on the universe and taking care of it, and they're all interested in making it the best that it can possibly be. And there's some problems with this. Why are things so screwed up? That's a question you might want to ask, right? And the Stoics would say, well, it only looks screwed up from where you're sitting. If you could really see how things are arranged and sort of like, choose to fit yourself into this scheme, you'd probably actually be a lot happier with the way it's arranged. So this is an explanation of not only God's nature, but also about something that we're going to call theodicy. This is a term that's worth knowing, and we're going to use it a couple other times in the semester. If there is a God, why are things the way they are? As screwed up as they appear to be. What are theodicy comes from? Theos meaning God, and hodos, which means path or way. And so it's a study, it's an explanation of the ways of God. And people ask this in religions, don't they? Why do good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people? That's a theodicus. That's a question of theodicy. I'm not even sure what the right word would be. Theodicical question. I don't know. Theodical, yeah. I suppose that would work. The Stoics had an explanation in their scheme of things. This may not be attractive to you. It was attractive to many people in ancient times. One of the things that you got out of this is the gods actually care about how things are. The gods actually, you're living in a universe that's not hostile to you. It may appear hostile at times, but it's not really hostile to you. It's really been set up for your benefit. Because human beings are, they're not the very top of the food chain, right? The ontological food chain. There's the divine above them, but they're the top as far as everything else goes. All this other stuff is there for rational creatures, gods and human beings. The gods also care about human beings, even to the level of being able to reveal to them what they want human beings to do or to look out for. That's what this divination stuff that the Stoics were so into was supposed to be about. So, you have a very interesting conception here, right? Do you see now how these different things fit in with each other? With these arguments for God's existence, which actually do reveal something about God's nature. And then you've got this whole conception of what we call cosmology, study of how the world is arranged. The next book is going to be attacks on this. So the Stoics now got to present their position, and now the academic, Kata, is going to tear down as much as he possibly can. And do some other stuff in the process too. So that's where we'll leave it off.